you. Now we move on to item 12, which is the changes to the urban rating area and the rating of farm and lifestyle properties within the urban rating area. And we stay with Andrew and welcome Beth as well. Andrew, over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The report on the agenda today is recommending decisions on the proposals to extend the urban rating area and apply residential rates to farm and lifestyle properties within the URA. Got a short presentation that will go over the issues and our advice, considers, set out a response to some of the questions you've asked us about the rating issues and infrastructure on the Hengaia Peninsula. So that arose from questions you raised at the workshop on the 5th of May that we haven't had an opportunity to answer yet. The current urban rating area is based on the metropolitan urban limit that was part of our planning rules that we had inherited at the amalgamation of the councils. It's now out of date with the adoption of the unitary plan. At present, residential and business properties outside the urban rating area pay 90% of the rates in the dollar that residential properties within the urban rating area pay, and business properties as well. Farm and lifestyle properties within the urban rating area pay 80% of the rates in the dollar that their residential neighbours pay. So the proposal that was consulted on was to extend the urban rating area to include all live zoned land within the rural-urban boundary in the unitary plan, except Warkworth. We also propose to rate farm and lifestyle properties in the urban rating area as urban residential. The city's expanding, and these changes ensure all ratepayers have their rates calculated on a similar basis to their neighbours as the city grows. Now, while farm and lifestyle properties within the urban rating area make less use of council services than their more intensely developed residential neighbours, they've got access to the same services, and the cost of the council making those available are similar because most of the costs of our services are fixed. The proposal uses our planning rules as the basis for changes to the URA now and automatically in the future, as we did previously with the metropolitan urban limit. Provides a mechanism for future adjustments as the city grows, eliminating the requirement to address this issue annually on a subjective and case-by-case basis. Service levels and accessibility formed a key part of our initial analysis that you saw before Christmas, and of the supporting information we provided to assist consultation. They were a key issue raised in feedback, particularly from those in the areas that were affected and in questions we've received from elected members. So we've investigated these issues extensively and provided information in the report on today's agenda, so you've got the material you need to have in front of you to support your decision making. The nature of council services varies widely across the city, as does relative accessibility to our facilities. This reflects historical decisions based on the preferences of the former councils and their communities. The variations in service levels and accessibility aren't unique to the areas we're proposing be included in the URA. Some of these areas have got services similar to neighbouring properties within the urban rating area, and to other areas on the present urban fringe who already pay urban rates like Waiheke, Titirangi and Langholm, for example. Now, our rates are a wealth tax on property. They're not a charge for service. However, the Local Government Act requires the council to consider a range of factors in making decisions on its rating policy, including, amongst other elements, the benefits properties receive from the services provided. Our advice has provided you with a detailed analysis of these issues to support your decision making. We'd note that it's not practical to set our rates based on the services available to each property. It's beyond our resources and current technology. So there's not a solely service-based approach that could be more than arbitrary given the complexity of our service offering and the historical variation across the city. However, land and capital values will reflect the accessibility and nature of council services available to properties, along with a whole range of other factors, and this is only one element clearly, but it is nevertheless an element. And we consider that having the rates on that capital value delivers an equitable basis to capture variations in service levels and accessibility. So the decisions you're making require the exercise of judgment, weighing the matters set out in their legislation, informed by the advice tendered in our report, which brings together our earlier advice and responses to the issues that have been raised in feedback and by yourselves. Feedback from consultation, where support for both proposals was over 50%, but was opposed by those who were going to be affected directly by it, and obviously your debate today. So our view is, after reviewing our earlier advice and investigating the matters that have been raised in feedback and by yourselves, that the proposals should be adopted as consulted on, but with the changes phased in over 3 years to mitigate the impact, particularly in the first year when we've got a slightly higher general rates increase. We'd also note there's a miscellaneous remissions policy available where properties where their rates might be unreasonable in relation to comparable rating units, and of course that our rates team will respond to any questions about the basis upon which properties are being assessed to ensure that they are being treated appropriately. Thank you. Beth and I are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to kick it off. I want to talk to you about Whenuapai and Herald Island, all right? I went out there with you, and as a result of that conversation, the locals submitted a map for consideration where they felt the rural-urban boundary should go. I want to know why, in your professional opinion, you do not agree with that map that was submitted by that group.
Thank you. Yes, we have had a look at the map that was submitted by the group and have visited the area and looked carefully at their situation relative to the rest of the city. There's 550 rating units in the Whenuapai village area and Herald Island, 270 in Herald Island. Whenuapai village doesn't have water and wastewater?
Sorry, it has. Whenuapai village has water, Herald Island has water and wastewater.
No, they don't have wastewater. Yeah. Don't have footpaths on both sides of the street, generally only on one side. There is a bus to the Whenuapai village, but not to Herald Island, which is 600 to 1600 metres away from the bus service. However, across the combined area, there are 15 reserves, 3 playgrounds, an exercise circuit, tennis court, and a small playing field. They do have some small community facilities that are council owned, but run by community volunteers. 2 halls, including an old post office museum and an old fire station. Now, the analysis that we've presented to you in our report today shows comparisons between the service in these areas and in other parts of the city at fringe. We haven't included these particular smaller facilities that are available. I think there's 3 on Herald Island for the 270 properties. But when looking at the relative accessibility, we've looked at more substantial council services that are further away. For example, they're about 8 to 15 minutes away from the library at Westgate. They're 4 minutes from the new Whenuapai special housing area development. It's got a new playground there, and 7-minute drive to Westgate. And I just repeat the earlier statement, we've got wide variety of services levels across the city and accessibility. And while the services in these areas might not be exactly the same as an area that's completely new, they are quite similar to other fringe areas of the city that are being urban rated already, and quite close to the developing area at Westgate. Beth, anything on the map you'd like to add?
Just in terms of the map, we did submit an alternative proposal for excluding Herald Island and Whenuapai, which just limits it to those areas that you're concerned with. And it means that if there's any changes to the future urban parts around it, they'll automatically be incorporated.
So that's one of the options that's presented in our paper, because it was one of the issues that councillors had expressed concern about. That's discussed in our advice. Our recommendation remains that they be included to treat them equitably with other fringe urban areas. Nevertheless, that's an option.
My second question, but before I ask, I should call for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Henderson, do you want to move? Do I have a seconder? Councillor Dalton, thank you. You also want to add something else?
Oh, yes, that I stopped at the recommendations, but I hadn't addressed the Hingaya issue. My apologies.
Oh, sorry. Well, can I just ask my second question on Herald Island, Whenuapai, then we'll go on to Hingaya, right? So my second question, and I think you've answered it, I just want to be absolutely sure, because Herald Island, I went to Herald Island. If you haven't been, team, you should go. Beautiful. Just stunning. But on there, they had a cute little, and I'll call it a library. It's a room with some books in it, and a cute little, I'll call it a community centre, but it actually is just, it's not even probably as big as this. You didn't include that library and that room as what I'll call a local community centre. You didn't include those two facilities as community facilities for Herald Island. Is that correct?
When we talk about community facilities and say there's 4 that count in that number, in terms of distance to things like community centres, they weren't counted. They weren't counted for a library. They are counted under our community facilities network plan as having a arts centre, as you noted, but I did note in my documentation that that was just that small venue there, and gave the distance to the Collins estate, which is further from them.
Thank you. I think that's important. Apologies for jumping in. Please cover Hingaya.
So at the 5 May workshop, there were some questions asked about the proposal to include properties in the Hingaya Peninsula in the urban rating area. Now, at present, part of the peninsula is included in the urban rating area and part isn't. So you can see on the map there, the red line delineates the urban from the rural. So concern's been expressed that some of the properties in the area are struggling to develop. Now, the council provides the bulk infrastructure to support development, and all of that has been provided to the Hingaya Peninsula. So they've got the bulk capacity provided by the council that would allow them to develop. However, in Hingaya and elsewhere in the city, the developers provide the local infrastructure that enables their development to connect to the council's bulk systems. In Hingaya, you've got some fragmented land ownership, and you need agreement from multiple landowners. Generally, you've got a couple of bigger developers, they'd put some of this works in, and the smaller ones would then be able to connect to it. There are issues in the Hingaya space, and there's some problems securing that agreement. So the Hayfield SHA is developing, as you can see on the map. Beth, do you want to talk us through this?
So just looking at this map here, it shows you a Google map from 2021. As you can see, there's extensive development occurring outside the current boundary. You can also see that there's some greenfield area within the current boundary. Some of those developments have already progressed to the point that the ones that are outside already progressed to having houses on. Others, like Hayfield SHA, part of that has already gone into subdivision. It has all the services required for that. But other parts of the Hayfield SHA have been delayed because of the collapse of the developer agreement around the supply of water. So one of the developers has gone into liquidation, and that means that the other developers that were waiting for them to complete their part of the work are now held up. So it's just highlighting again that it's very hard to draw a line between those that can develop and those can't, and because the reasons behind why projects may be delayed. it's ultimately up to the developers themselves and whether they can reach agreement.
So on both sides of the boundary, you've got properties developing. However, on both sides, there are some issues that are delaying development. You can see here, reinforcing the point we made earlier, that land and capital values will reflect differences between properties and hence the rates they paid. You can see the undeveloped property, capital value, land value 27 million, developed property, land value 90, capital value 114, affecting their rates. So looking at the question that was put to us, if we retain the current boundary, you're going to have an equitable treatment of neighbouring properties across that boundary, whether they're developed or undeveloped. They'll pay different rates on either side if we retain the status quo. Now, we could look to redefine the boundary based on ability to develop, but that would require a property by property assessment and trying to draw some judgments about whether the delays to development were because I was keen, but unfortunately my neighbour wasn't, and or I was being difficult about development and not really making the contribution to getting that local network infrastructure done. Some quite tricky issues to draw judgments on. We could introduce a remission. We'd have to go and consult on that first, and it would also require that property by property assessment, whether some of the factors will be difficult to make an assessment of. Our recommendation is to adopt the proposal that will deliver an equitable basis for setting the rates for properties in the Hingaya Peninsula, see that they're rated fairly relative to their neighbours. And we'd also note that some of these development issues would apply to existing greenfields areas already in the urban rating area.
Okay, questions? Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Beth and Andrew, thank you for all the work you've done here, and also I want to acknowledge the ongoing support that they've given to me as a councillor trying to get to the bottom of this issue. So I've just got two questions. In the report, it talks about, and I'll concentrate on Kemu, Huapai and Riverhead, that they could be excluded, right, as part of the consultation process. So why? It seems like we put it in, but it could be excluded, which is a little bit counterintuitive. But is that really saying, Andrew, that today it's our judgment call on the information that you're giving us today, whether we include those or not?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, thank you. And would it be within scope if I put up a potential amendment to have Huapai, Kemu, Riverhead and potentially Dairy Flat, which are all within Rodney, deferred on the grounds of sensible argument, and that my colleagues agree with that judgment call, that could be deferred to the next LTP? Is that within scope or out of scope of the consultation that we've done?
That's definitely within the scope of the consultation. We identified Kemu, Huapai, Riverhead area in particular as areas with higher levels of service availability and access than rural areas, but not quite as high as the urban areas, and that's all laid out in the materials, and the choice in regard to that was particularly highlighted, and obviously the choice exists for all the other elements of this decision as well.
So supplementary, if I may, because I think that's a good question. In your professional opinion, should they be included?
We would say that yes, they should be included. There's some examples of the relative rates in the report and or the previous workshop advice that we provided you with. And while the service levels aren't quite at urban levels, they're above rural, the areas are developing fast, and the relative land values will reflect the relative accessibility to services.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Watson.
I just want to start with picking up the commentary on our obligations under the Local Government Act at point 20. When decisions when making decisions, the council is limited by the scope of the original consultation. Decisions can only be made within the bounds of the options considered in the proposal. So I'm assuming from that wording there that we are bound by the precise wording that we included in our consultation document.
So that would apply within reason, and the consultation was on an option to extend the urban rating area. The status quo always remains an option, and the areas that Councillor Sayers asked about are not in the urban rating area under the status quo. So that's within the scope.
So I'm picking up on some specific and fundamental phrasing from our proposal, which said extending the urban rating area, so land that has that land affected, basically, quote, pays the same urban rates as nearby properties that have access to a similar level of service. So we all understand what the word nearby means, don't we? You know, something's nearby, it's a short distance, not far away or close. Obviously, that's pretty much our understanding of it. However, and I'm talking about Herald Island and Whenuapai here, when it gets to your recommendation to exclude Herald Island, Whenuapai Village, these areas have similar service levels and development to urban rated areas in Waiheke or Langholm, and that's repeated throughout. So are Waiheke and Langholm nearby to Herald Island and Whenuapai? Because clearly nearby in the context of this area is West Harbour, it's Hobsonville, it's Green High, it's Albany at a pinch. Are they the new pin-up boys and girls for urban amenity in Auckland, Waiheke Island and Langholm?
So there's a couple of issues here. One is the similar level of service. You've got a full analysis of the service accessibility of that all the various areas of Auckland do, an acknowledgement in that advice that the service levels differ across the region, and identification from an equity perspective, which is one of the other matters that's implicitly required to be considered by us in providing you with advice on rating matters, that there are other parts of the city with similar levels of service, and we've provided that advice to support your consideration of the issue.
Just further to that, the access to community facilities is very similar for Herald Island, Whenuapai Village and Whenuapai SHA, which you seem to be agreeing to go in terms of that they will have to travel to many of the facilities. In terms of things like nicking footpaths or connections to water and wastewater, any of the undeveloped land that's within Hobsonville and in the Whenuapai SHA will have similar levels of service.
Well, I guess I don't want to get into a disagreement with what's the appropriate levels of service, but I just wanted to make that point there that Waiheke and Langholm, which by the sound of things, you know, a case could have been made for them going back the other way, as indeed is which has happened with some other property, aren't nearby properties, and any of the submitters have not compared themselves to Langholm or Waiheke Island. That's an entirely inappropriate comparison point in terms of the actual wording of the consultation. The other point I wanted to question you about on page 463 of the supporting information goes to, and this was again fairly important to submitters, it states that it is appropriate to charge urban rates if on average the service levels available in the area are similar to other areas. So on average, again, a standard or level that is considered to be typical or usual. So in terms on average, the service levels for that charge to be justified would have to be similar to the surrounding areas, and that would have to be looking at it across the board. So we identified 3 clear areas, didn't we? Public transport, travel, demand, community services, which we're concentrating on a lot, are just a third of that. And then we have roads and stormwater infrastructure. So that commentary there tells us we're going to look at this on average and we're going to compare it to nearby properties. I don't see where the on average assessment has occurred in terms of across all those facilities in relation to specific areas.
So the information we've provided you does set out the current state of the services, particularly on safe. We take, for example, Herald Island and Whenuapai. If you look in our report, the nature of the footpaths and stormwaters is referred to in there. And you can see that in relation to newly developing areas of the city, water areas in the other parts of the fringe, and similarly the discussion of community services and access to other facilities and public transports available for you to consider. That information is there for you to exercise your judgment on what you think will be fair and equitable. There were questions raised during the consultation which have helped our work, and we've sought to inform those so you can have that in front of you today and have the debate that you're asking questions of now, Councillor.
Okay, so just a couple of factual items just to pick up, which are important in terms of accuracy of information here. In respect of the comparison of service levels on page 408, wastewater, it says yes for Herald Island and Whenuapai Village, but we should have made it clear that it's no for Whenuapai Village, shouldn't we?
Thanks for that, and we've spotted that as well.
Okay.
I think Beth mentioned it earlier in the presentation. So
Okay, and then it is in a footnote there, but it is important to it's not picked up elsewhere, but the footnote here in terms of the bus service, there is no bus service on Herald Island.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
I saw the bus when I visited, but I think it was being cancelled at the time.
Yep. Yeah. And in terms of that arts centre, cultural centre, we're still persisting with that in terms of the council definition as it goes to a facility. Even in this instance, it's housing a couple of paintings. So we haven't taken that out, even though we're saying it's a cultural centre.
When we've noted that it is indeed a council facility that's available on the island. However, when comparing the relative accessibility to art centres, the distance that we've provided in our analysis is to the one in Westgate, or the Corbin Estate, because of the difference in the scale of the, as you pointed out, Councillor.
Okay, so just my final question, Madam Chair, and it goes to the notion of what councillors should be considering here, is that we should be bound by the exact wording that we've proposed on, because that's what the public have submitted on in good faith, and that we should be looking to come together for some average assessment across the three main areas that we identified repeatedly throughout that consultation and the supporting information in terms of stormwater eroding, community facilities, transport and travel demand. That's correct, isn't it?
That's the information we've provided you with to support your decision making.
Yeah, and just finally, the Langhome Waiheke Island standard, the prominence it seems to have taken, certainly in a number of points in relation to Herald Island and Whenuapai. That's not contingent or in keeping with the settlements nearby. It's a standard that we're making a judgment on as being similarly rated, but in this instance not appropriate to the nearby suburbs that people have actually submitted on. And I make that point because I think it's an important one in terms of the good faith submissions of people, and they're unable to compare or make a case with Langhome and Waiheke unless they live there or they're aware of it. Okay, sorry, that was a bit garbled, but I think I made my point.
Yeah, yeah. All right, I'll talk later. Councillor Walker.
Sure. So I've just got a question around Whenuapai, and that goes to the comparison between Whenuapai and future urban zones. future urban zones are defined as areas that, for example, don't have bulk infrastructure, and the items there that you cover off are stormwater, water and wastewater, and also arterial roads. If we look at Whenuapai, how does Whenuapai compare in respect of the bulk infrastructure that's available?
So just noting, obviously, that Herald Island does have water and wastewater already. Just a comment around future urban zone. The delivery of these services happen over different periods of time. Things like arterial roads, because they travel through areas. Some areas may actually have an arterial road. Other properties within the FUZ may actually be able to connect up to some services in adjacent areas. That's one of the issues we have, is that you can't necessarily define this at a property by property level. The planning rules give us a good broad indication of where services are available now. The Whenuapai village itself, as you note, is surrounded by future urban, but it was allowed to develop up to a higher level than the current rural development that's allowed in the future urban zone.
So just to be clear then, you're saying that Whenuapai village is surrounded by future urban, which of course doesn't have bulk infrastructure. So what I'm trying to arrive at is the similarity between Whenuapai village and the future urban area that lies around it that is left out of the urban rating area. So my question, which follows on from the comparison that Councillor Watson was making around all of those other services that aren't available, also goes to the issue of bulk infrastructure and the unavailability of that as it goes to Whenuapai for a number of those services. And I just wanted to establish whether that's the case or not. And what time frame are we looking at for possible provision of any of these services within the 10-year plan?
I'm afraid you have to talk to our planning department about that and look at what investment we're making through the capital program. As you are aware, it's zoned future urban, so it's not planned to develop now. It will be in the future. There is a reasonable amount of land within the urban rating area that is paying urban rates already, that doesn't have services such as water, wastewater, varying levels of standards of roads. It just reflects the fact that these areas will develop at different times to different standards, and Whenuapai Village and Herald Island are just other examples of this.
Are there other areas, though, around Auckland that effectively are surrounded by future urban? So they're almost an island, if you like. Are there other comparisons, or is this a distinct area in terms of an anomaly?
So there is dairy flat properties that have been picked up like this. Obviously, most of the urban area is, because it's based on the current MUL, is fairly developed. There's certainly examples of areas such as Hingaya, where you've got properties very similar to the ones on Herald Island and Whenuapai Village that are surrounded by greenfield and don't have the local network connections to connect. There's Kimuhuapai, which are obviously surrounded by rural land as opposed to future urban zone. So
my other question just goes to the maps. Is it the case that it's very easy to identify the particular areas in Whenuapai and in Herald Island that we're discussing here that are anomalies? You can draw a line around them fairly easily?
I have provided those maps as attachment F to the report.
A couple of key points here. Herald Island and Whenuapai don't have the same level of service or the same development potential as, say, Flatbush or some of the other areas of the city we see developing rapidly at the city fringe. However, they have got, for many of these services, they are within a reasonable distance already of many council facilities. The level of service that they are presently receiving is not unique, nor is their development potential. There are many other parts of the city with a similar level of development potential that are already in the urban rating area, many other parts of the city with similar degrees of access to service or the nature of stormwater or footpath services and roads. There's a lot of information in the materials we've provided you with today to allow you to make a judgment on what will be the equitable basis to rate these properties.
My last question really just goes to this aspect of capital value. So my understanding from what you're saying is that capital value is a good reflection on where a property is at in terms of its appropriateness to pay rates around a level of service or the like, or at least is reflecting most appropriately the rating from a property tax point of view.
The land and capital value of a property will reflect a range of factors, but it will also reflect the accessibility and nature of council services. They may not be the primary factors, but they will be reflected in the property's values.
So I guess the follow-on question I've got is, in an instance where we are relying very much on capital value as being reflective of an appropriate rate, is it not conceivable that if you've got anomalies, and I'm referring to Herald Island and Whenuapai, that not including those areas in the urban rating area may be a good match for the level of service criteria, but you've still got the capital value to fall back on? And would that not be a fairer approach for us to take?
That is certainly one of the approaches that's available to the councillors today to consider. We would not argue for that. Our professional view is that they are not anomalies in terms of their service levels. There are other parts of the city with similar service levels, so they're not unique in that respect. And that the best mechanism we have of treating everyone equitably is through the capital value rating system.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other further questions? Yes, I have. Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. Andrew and Beth, tēnā korua. Look, I just want to ask a couple of simple questions. In regards to the report that you've done, bearing in mind all the information you received in the submissions, plus also taking into effect Part 6 of the Local Government Act 2002, is that all the information that you were given to us at workshops and also the information contained in this report, that the recommendations are to the best of your ability and experience, the best recommendations for us to consider to move forward in regards to addressing the inequality that is raised in point 16.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, team, for the work done on this. I know it's been very complicated. My question is, pre-2016, this adjustment happened automatically. Based on the evidence you've given us, if that process had still happened, would these properties already be paying urban rates without the decision we're making today?
It's difficult to say because the unitary plan rules differ from the MUL, and that's why we're going through this decision process. Most of this development land would have been included within the MUL and would have automatically been rated as it grew, but I can't speak to specifics for specific areas.
Okay, so before, but even though it's a slightly different process, this would have, when you change the boundary, automatically the rates would have changed as opposed to this process.
And I mean, perhaps as an example, if you look at Hungaya, which was based around the MUL. You can see it captured a lot of land. It's very similar to Herald Island, to Whenuapai Village. You can see that little bit of development just on the coast there. That's all, properties that developed a while ago that don't have water, don't have wastewater, don't have a bus service, don't have footpaths, but they've been paying urban rates under the MUL since the start of the rating policy.
So when the MUL expanded out to this area, then these properties were captured in the urban rating boundary.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Right, we'll move to comments. Comments. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, Beth and Andrew, for this work. The stuff is challenging here, and when I first saw it, I was against it because I thought there was too many anomalies. But the deeper I dived into the information and the one-on-one sessions I had with our staff, actually, I came to the realisation, one, there are variations of service levels and the quality of those services right across the city. There's no standard. So it's an anomalous measurement to have. Are these the areas more akin to an urban form than a rural form? Are they live zoned? Those are the key points. And just because it's not developed, because a developer or a property owner decides they don't want to fund the infrastructure, there's no reason why it can't actually be activated into a residential or a business zone or whatever. It can be up, it is live zone, so it can happen. It's that choice of that person not to do so. Their property values have risen, and I'll give them fair credit because they're actually paying rates, even if all they be rural rates, but they're paying them on a very high valuation. They will go again once the live zoning is activated. Most of these areas are really highly fragmented anyway. And I look at the ones that are down south, there's a lot of them. There's areas that is going to be developed in the foreseeable future. And just because someone doesn't want to sell or fund that development themselves, there's no reason for them to remain a rural rate when everything around them is currently urban or is going to be urban in the foreseeable future. In fact, some of these property owners are getting in the way of the urbanisation of the land around them. And that is part of the problem. So there will be anomalies here, and there is an out. So if someone feels they have been untruly handled with this phase and approach, and they don't want it, there is a rates remission process they can enter into, or they can talk to our staff about, okay, what is more fair and what is more equitable on a one-on-one basis, not as a group. But I think that's a far better way forward. But generally speaking, and there will be problems, I'm sure. We identified mapping areas with Andrew and Beth. We identified some anomalies in infrastructure provisioning that it wasn't actually for that area, and we got those changed. And I thank them for that. But this process allows for the out, but also puts a lot in that probably should be paying a urban rate as they are live zoned, and that's a critical point. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, just a point of order, I did signal that I wanted to put an amendment forward. Can that amendment be put forward,
Yes, it can.
please?
Hold on, we'll take that amendment then, because we've got to move on second to the substantive. We'll take that amendment.
Should have done it bloody the workshop.
So do you have a seconder, councillor?
Do I have a seconder? Anybody? Tracy, thank you.
You've got the- Right, we have an amendment. Would you like to speak to your amendment, councillor?
I would. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. And I'm really going to echo the message that we got from the local board chair when Phelan came in to speak to us on this topic. And I think the key message I'm trying to deliver here is it's not appropriate. What I've done is I've ring-fenced out some Rodney townships that are currently included in the proposal. And what I'm suggesting is it's too early to go with those particular townships, and I'm about to explain why. Uniquely, and the Mayor raised this earlier about targeted rates and how Franklin put in a targeted rate to get their roads sealed. Well, Rodney did put in a targeted rate, a transport targeted rate. Now, they could use that for road sealing, whatever they wanted to. But what they chose to do is actually there's no bus services provided by Auckland Transport into those areas. So they're funding those themselves out of a targeted rate. When that targeted rate went in, it was equivalent to a 7.3% average rate increase for those ratepayers, the catchment, and that's all of Rodney's paying that. So they're taking that money and trying to get some basic services in there. So it's the reason why those communities have overwhelmingly said, look, we don't think it's the right thing to do. It's because they know that infrastructure isn't up to scratch to the rest of the area. The officers are saying something different, but the community is saying, well, we live this, we experience this, and the local board and myself are trying to explain that they're right. The fact that they'd have to pay again on top of that so soon without the infrastructure being in there isn't right. They are building up, as the Deputy Mayor said, they are changing over time, they are building up, but the investments back into their by Auckland Council aren't occurring. In fact, the chair of the Rodney Local Board has indicated that there's been no investment over 7 years into those areas by Auckland Council in significant ways, particularly, and this is the pain point, and this is the main point that came across in the documentation, the feedback that came back, was around the traffic around the roads. So central government put in some special housing areas which are online now. They've come online, they're live. As a result of that, the traffic has increased. What didn't happen, and in Auckland Council we opposed it because we knew this was going to happen, right? It's gone in. They have to keep giving those building consents by law. We have to keep processing them as a regulatory agency. We can't stop it. But the cars keep turning up there. Not cycleways, not walkways, not bus services, not swimming pools, not new facilities. They just haven't existed. That's why I asked the question of Andrew earlier. It's a judgment call. They put it into this paper to go out for consultation, but we can take it out. And that's what I'm suggesting we should do, because another 3 years when we relook at the LTP, and this was the plea from the Rodney Local Board, was don't do it now while we've still got that targeted rate in there. Right? We can remove that targeted rate at some time, but at the moment we've got park and rides being built, bus services being built, footpaths being built using that, just to catch up. So you can imagine a community's concern when we go and say, well, we're going to now take you up to an urban rate. It just doesn't match, Madam Chair. So look, I think I've covered all my points there. There isn't the future planning in place there. They're having a structured plan done, I think, in 2028. It's probably an appropriate time when this should be being looked at. So what I'm asking of my colleagues is to please use your judgment. Please hear what I've just said. Push it out for 3 years. Let's do it in the next LTP. Support your local board. Support the public voice. And just remember that those townships are paying an extra targeted rate right now just to bring them up to scratch. So that's my argument, Madam Chair, and I hope people would support me.
Thank you, Councillor. Anybody else in support of the amendment? Councillor?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity, and thank you, Councillor, for the comments. I think that it's pretty clear. It's like a double whammy. So I absolutely support this. And I was out there in the weekend having a look around too. So we need to just be mindful of the proposed rates that would be, well, the rates, if we proceed with a 5%, that would be imposed on these people over and above the draft that we have before us. So I support it because I've been out there, I've looked at it, I've seen the area, and I don't believe you should be imposing 2 lots of rates on the community that, to be fair, should be getting the base services anyway, because that's a responsibility of the council to put the services in, and then they go from there in terms of their development. So I support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Tamsin? Anybody else in support? Anyone against? Councillor Darby.
Look, I might just say this once rather than go to the main motion later on, but just to give you a bit of a snapshot of our draft RLTP and how it affects this area. Northwest growth improvements, 186 million. State Highway 18 Squadron Drive interchange, which Herald Islanders need to get to Westgate. We've just heard that it's their preferred community hub. That's how they get there, by that investment in the west-facing State Highway 18 Squadron Drive ramp improvements. That's 68 million. Share of supporting growth allocation, there's about, supporting growth has an allocation in the RLTP of about 108 million. quite a lot of that actually is in the north, from Dairy Flat across to the northwest. It's a total of 108. Even if I just say 25 million for northwest, it's a fair chunk. Huapai improvements, 18 million. And then there are some others, but they're too small to refer to. Then there's the increased share of a massive boost in the renewals budget of $4 billion. So that just gives you a little flavour just in the transport space. And as you heard me say before, it's not enough, but there is a lot of investment going northwest and upper north.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else wanting to speak against? Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Chair. The reason I asked our staff in regards to the work that they've done is really on number 16. This is why I pointed out 16 to them. I don't know how many times around this debating chamber and desk we've talked about how do we end up addressing inequality. In 16, it's got the retaining the current urban rating area will mean increasing inequality in rating between new and existing urban areas. The last paragraph is the one that has impact on me. This is why I spoke about 16. This impact can be mitigated by transitioning the change over 3 years. What this recommendation is asking is that we wait another 3 years before we actually again debate. I got no problems at all in saying that I guarantee we end up getting into the same position we're in now and saying, okay, let's wait another 3 years for transitioning to the new urban rate. I'm not prepared to wait another 3 years when I know not only with this, but and all the inequality that we have around this area, that we end up sort of saying, look, we'll give them another 3 years. No, I will not be voting for that. I don't know how many times again we end up talking about around this table inequality. So I will not be supporting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other speakers for the amendment? I'll put it to the vote then, although a division has been called. Please take the division.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, you're voting on the amendment on your screen. Mayor Goff.
No.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Bartley.
No.
Councillor Casey.
No.
Councillor Collins.
Against.
Councillor Coombe.
Against.
Councillor Cooper.
Against.
Councillor Dalton.
Against.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipaina.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Councillor Henderson.
Against.
Councillor Hills.
Against.
Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
No.
Councillor Sayers.
Or
Councillor Stewart. IMSB Chair Taipari. Councillor Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson. Councillor Young. Chair Simpson. Lost 7 votes to 15.
The amendment has lost 7 votes to 15. Right, we go back to the substantive. There is another amendment, and it is by Councillor Watson. Do you have a seconder, Councillor? Councillor Walker. Would you like to speak to it? Thank you.
Actually, I've been a little bit remiss here because what I should have made clear, and this goes to Whenuapai Village and Herald Island, and that's why it's separate. There's different factors here at work than compared to Councillor Sayers. What I should have made really clear at the outset is that we have multiple areas now ward affected by this urban rating proposal, and we have agreed with most of them. So this isn't a blanket denial. We have actually agreed that, yeah, Scott Point, parts of Hobsonville, the new part of Whenuapai, yeah, hands up, you've got a case there. We don't agree in Whenuapai Village and Herald Island. Neither do the local community, neither do the Ratepayers Association, neither do the local board. So all the people that know the conditions on the ground disagree with this, and disagree with it strongly, but agree to the other parts of the area that are affected by it. So it's not just a blanket kind of refusal. It's very important, I think, to base our discussion on what we proposed, what we actually went out on, because that's what people submitted on, and that was to pay the same urban rates as nearby properties that have access to similar levels of service. That's what we consulted upon. And we were very specific in the documentation as to what the comparison would be made. So there's no sort of big doubt here. We're very specific down to percentages. So we identify one area was roads, footpaths and stormwater services, 21% of the general rate. Community services and grants, 33%. Public transport and travel demand, 18%. That was the three areas we identified that we'd make our decision on, and that's what the people submitted on. So I just want to ask all of you, wherever you live, hopefully most people in an urban area, I want to ask you if this reminds you of where you live, because this is what these people live in. Okay, Herald Island and Whenuapai, roads, footpaths, stormwater services. Stormwater services. Virtually every road in Herald Island and Whenuapai village have open swales and ditches. There is no curb and channeling. There is inadequate stormwater infrastructure, which means when it rains, the septic tanks leak, and on the berms, there's raw sewage and there's stagnant water in the ditches. That's stormwater services. Footpaths. The local Ratepayers Association surveyed all the footpaths. They found 50% of them had no footpaths at all on either side of the road and had open ditches. 43% had a footpath on one side but were poorly maintained with open drains. The standards of footpaths in Whenuapai village and the surrounding rural areas are classified as rural by Auckland Transport. That's footpaths. Roads. Cowrie Road is the big main road in. So think of Onawa Road, think of some big main road you live on. It's the main connector road for both communities. It has no footpaths, open ditches on both sides of the road, no provision for pedestrians or cyclists. The Causeway is the main road into Herald Island. No footpaths on either side, dangerous for pedestrians. The Ratepayers Association summed it up as narrow verges and steep-sided drains mean pedestrians, runners and cyclists take their lives into their hands navigating. That's their main roads into their settlements. So that's stormwater, footpaths, roads. Does that sound like where you live? Second part was community services, 33% of the general rate. This is defined in the consultation as being within a 15-minute drive. That should really strike a few alarm bells with some of the people that are aware of climate change and public transport here. In this 2021, we're defining access by driving a car 15 minutes. That would mean in my own old area, Birkdale, where I was growing up, under this criteria, I could go to the city or Takapuna to access my pool, my library, my whatever, and that would be acceptable. We never did that in Birkdale back in the 60s. We could go to the Birkenhead War Memorial Park, the Highbury Library, we could walk or we could get a bus or we could cycle. But under this criteria, that's acceptable. No, it's not. Maybe you have to bring back the old Birkenhead Borough Council, I don't know. As far as the facilities go, the closest pool is outside that time anyway. The cultural centre, as we see, is a little fire station building that has 4 paintings on it. The community hall is not owned by Auckland Council in Whenuapai. It was built by the local community. It is maintained by the local community. It is run by the local community. That's a rural model. That's not an Auckland Council model. Similarly with the Herald Island Hall, it's run by volunteers. There's no sports grounds on Herald Island. Under that 15-minute criteria, if you don't have a car, you're stuffed. Herald Island have got no bus service. How do they get there? How do the young kids get there? They can't drive a car. That's an absurdity, that 15-minute criteria in this day and age. Final one, public transport and traffic demand statement. Herald Island has no bus service. Do you have a bus service? They don't. Whenuapai, they have a bus service, and for the most part of the day, that is hourly. That's their bus service, and it's a one-way, either goes to Westgate or Hobsonville Point. Traffic demand, there is no traffic demand. The main roads are really dangerous. No footpaths, no curbing, ditches. The one poor old guy there lived there his whole life, fell over, broke his shoulder blades. So they don't stack up at all. So if we're talking about the average, and that's what we said in the consultation document we would do, we would look at the average. It doesn't even come close, not even close. And that's why we're so enraged about this, because it's just not fair. It doesn't meet the criteria we consulted on across all those things. And the people submitted in big numbers. They acknowledged where the urban rating proposal should be spread to, but they said, look, it just doesn't apply to us. It's just not fair. And as I said, we said we would look at the average across all those things. One thing that has disturbed me a little bit at this late piece, Madam Chair, is the entry of Langholm and Waiheke Island into the comparison, as if Langholm and Waiheke Island are now the arbiters for the urban amenity across Auckland. That's not what we went out with. Anyone would know they're down the lower end. They're not nearby like we said we were going to compare them with. In fact, it sounds to me as, there's a case for their exclusion too, but that's another story. But at any rate, that's not what we consulted upon. It's an inappropriate comparison to be saying what similar levels of service are. So I don't really know what more to say, folks. Really, this is just not fair. If you went out to those areas, those people are far closer to rural than they are urban, and you're looking to increase their rates by 16 to 29%. A lot of the family, they're not wealthy families, as we've heard. 16 to 29%. If it's staggered, big deal. The case hasn't been proven. So all I would say, ladies and gentlemen, is that think of those things that I described that are uncontested there and say, does that sound to you like urban service standards? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
Sure. I obviously want to speak in support of that amendment, and I'd encourage everybody to read it. I support all of the comments that my fellow ward councillor made. Quite obviously, one, there's the issue of fairness and what we actually went out with, which was around services, access to services and similar levels of service. And as John has pointed out, these people don't have those services. As I mentioned earlier, not only do they not have the services that we're referring to here, but in many instances they don't have the bulk infrastructure that satisfies the criteria for these future urban areas. And in the case of Herald Island, certainly they're surrounded by future urban areas, and so is much of Whenuapai. So what we're doing here is really not entering into good faith with the people that have submitted. And I'd point out that their submissions, and I'm talking about the detailed submissions, have been very genuine, substantive submissions based on what we, that's Auckland Council, asked them to submit on. And now we're going to be making decisions around different criteria. The other point that I'd make is that you've got a couple of aspects to rating. Obviously, you've got the property tax issue. That's already captured, as I substantiated earlier, in the capital value. But in respect of the other thing that we rate for, which is around specific things, and we're talking here around services, these people in these areas aren't going to be getting any of those services, not now, not in the 10 years. That's the reality. So there is simply not an appropriate match there. And the other point that I substantiated is these areas that are anomalies are very easy to identify. We're already identifying future urban areas within the limits, so we're already drawing lines It's very easy to identify these areas, and the officers have the maps, so we're quite positioned to vote for this amendment. And the last point that I'd make is that the circumstance that we have now is quite different to the earlier situation around the metropolitan urban limits. We're zoning for huge amounts of additional infill across Auckland. And there are always going to be anomalies where we are not going to be able to provide the bulk infrastructure or for that matter services in some locations. Not now, and as I said earlier, not for 10 years. So we have to recognise those anomalies. We cannot and should not have a one-size-fits-all across Auckland. We don't have it for many things, and I'd suggest we shouldn't have it for this. So I would urge you to vote for a very simple amendment here. We're excluding Herald Island and Whenuapai Village, as John has mentioned. We're comfortable with other areas that are included, for example, the area of Whenuapai, where they have got cycleways and walkways and the like. But in these areas, particularly parts of Whenuapai, you've got sewage that runs out onto the streets, the areas that people walk, because they don't have stormwater and they don't have sewage. And in many instances, they don't have footpaths. That's the reality that these people live in, and it is simply not fair to rate them in the manner that we're proposing. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to speak in favour as well. I want to focus on one point, and that's around the travel time distances to council facilities. And, you know, we're not talking about brand new flash facilities either that these people are trying to make their way to. But the key thing, in other words, they're not all brand new. The key point I want to make is the travel time, that 15-minute travel time that other councils have touched on. That just isn't possible in the environment and traffic conditions that exist in the area.
Thank you. Councillors against the amendment? Well, I'll speak against. And I do so having been out twice to both the Whenuapai Village and Herald Island. I went out once with Andrew. I wanted to see for myself exactly what the facilities were and how they operated, and we actually spoke to the Residents Association. I didn't take any other councillor with me. I wanted to have a complete independent view, and I wanted to make sure Andrew was challenged in that meeting by those who spoke to him, and he was able to respond to those with whom we met. They then presented a map that they thought was a better version of the proposal that we had. And Andrew went through that map and he disagreed in his professional opinion that map was right. I went back again and had another look because I was particularly concerned in our workshop, and I'm not going to bring up what happened in the workshop, but there was information that was presented in the workshop that I just needed to recheck again, so I went back for a second time. And I asked Andrew again some information about my second visit. And both visits, they had this cute little telephone box with books in it, and I was very concerned that they were calling that their library. And I had to make sure that that's not what Andrew meant. It was just like, I don't know about you guys, but in Meadowbank, in my area, they've just put a little men's shed, just created this tiny little library on the side of the road, for kids to take books. So I just wanted to make sure it was an extra and it wasn't a proper library. And again, their community facility was a quite a small area, and although there's only 247 properties in the area, might work just for sort of local stuff. I wanted to make sure that wasn't part of the change of the urban rating, and that's been answered. I've said this in the workshop, but I'll say it publicly. Parrotto Drive has only got a footpath on one side of the road. We have sewage running down the road at Hapua Street in Remuera, and that's one of the reasons that I am supporting the increase to the water quality targeted rate. So it's not as if what's happening in that area is so different. Look, it's certainly not the middle of town, and it's certainly not some of the built-up areas. But Andrew has been challenged as the professional that helps us look through this issue. and I trust his judgment and his professional capacity that he's got it right. I think the compromise of working this through over 3 years is a good compromise. The first piece of advice was to do it straight away in one go and acknowledge that the financial implication from rural to urban is 381 over that period of time. So of course it's a lot less if it's transitioned, and I'm really keen to do that. The other thing I just want to make sure that everyone's really clear that we haven't consulted on something that different to what we're voting on. So when we talked about in the consultation document, the fact that we were looking at developing areas and towns near the current urban rating area that had similar levels of access to service and nearby properties, John, you've brought that up, and I think it's important to deal with that. But what we were proposing is the proposal was to set the urban rating area to include all the land that has an operative urban zoning or which had resource consent to be developed for urban use now, except for Warkworth. So in voting against this amendment, I'm doing so only because I have really personally looked at those areas and challenged our staff around that, and I feel comfortable in the response. Anybody else want to speak on the amendment before I take it to the vote? Right, thank you. I'll call for the division on the amendment, and I'll ask staff to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, you're voting on the amendment which is on your screen. Mayor Goff.
No.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Bartley.
No.
Councillor Casey.
No.
Councillor Collins is not here. Councillor Coombe.
Against.
Councillor Cooper. Councillor Dalton.
Against.
Councillor Darby.
Against.
Councillor Filipina.
Against.
Councillor Fletcher.
For.
Councillor Henderson.
Against.
Councillor Hills.
Against.
Councillor Mulholland.
For.
Councillor Newman.
Yes.
Councillor Sayers.
For.
Councillor Stewart. MSB Chair Taipari.
No.
Councillor Walker.
Yes.
Councillor Watson. Yes. Councillor Young. Chair Simpson.
The motion was lost, 8 votes to 13. We now go back to the substantive, and I'll ask for people to speak in support. I'll ask for people to speak against. I will take it to the vote. Okay.
Look, thank you, Chair. And the difficulty for me is that I'm asked to vote for this proposition. I don't fundamentally disagree with the argument that access to services should be the criteria for paying this rate. I personally happen to think that there's a Herald Island that's a special case. But the issue that I have with this, and it goes to Hengaia, it's not the access to services. They do have access to services. It's the ability to develop. And I fundamentally disagree with the information, the advice that's been presented to me. Based on my experience working with these property owners previously, who don't begrudge paying the rates, what they desperately want is to urbanise. And it's, I've read here in a couple of the slides that the land ownership fragmented, agreement of multiple owners required. I can tell you that there has been agreement from multiple owners for development in Hengaia. You know what's been the handbrake to that? It's been Auckland Council family that has been the handbrake to that. When a commercially viable development gets put up, but it's knocked back because it doesn't suit Auckland Transport's model for a grid development, instead, Auckland Transport wants 1 or 2 property owners to allow their houses to basically be knocked over to form a grid pattern as a prerequisite for any resource consent from Auckland Transport. I'm sorry, that knocks that development out completely. So I fundamentally disagree with the idea that there isn't agreement from multiple owners. There has been agreement negotiated, and it has been Auckland Council family that has said no. Secondly, I don't actually agree that all the bulk infrastructure is in place. Veolia is the local infrastructure provider for Hengaia, and it does not have that peninsula sufficiently covered to provide the infrastructure. If you went and sought a connection for water today, you probably couldn't get it. Why? Because actually the infrastructure isn't in place. The other point that I'd make is that there has actually been infrastructure that's required as a prerequisite for development, which has actually been taken out. Councillor Darby reflected on the investment in the northwest. Well, I can reflect on the traffic and roading infrastructure that isn't there. The very important safety infrastructure for the corner of Hengaia Road and Auckland Road, that has been removed because we have to help fund the ATAP projects for Kāinga Ora. You know, we can't go ahead with urbanising unless millions of dollars of infrastructure that would previously agreed needs to take place. We've pulled that all back, which actually denies the ability of people to go ahead and develop in that location. This is difficult, Chair, because I deeply respect the advice I've received in relation to access to services. I don't disagree with that. But when you come to a proposition that says council has provided sufficient bulk infrastructure capacity to enable development, no, I don't agree with that, based on my experience. I've sat in the Deputy Mayor's boardroom with the landowners and the officers trying to seek agreement around this, and I haven't been able to get it. And it's not been the developers. It's not been the developers. I think that the issue, it is a very difficult one, Chair, because, Hengaia has always been a problem insofar as it is fragmented. There is a lot of piecemeal stuff that goes. Paurika Road, $4 million that we had to spend to upgrade Paurika Road, not for the connections for these rural and large lot. It's actually to provide conveyance for the harbourside residents to be able to connect through to Hengaia Road so that they're not living in splendid isolation. $4 million, Councillor Coombe, that was spent on 700 metres of roading in Hengaia, and I bet if you knew that, you wouldn't be very happy with the sort of infrastructure that we had to put in place to enable all those cars to drive through there. I think that the proposition here, I understand the concept, but actually the infrastructure deficit remains. Andrew Chin's just trying to confirm to me if we've gazetted the old abandoned stormwater ponds at Bottletop Bay. Even once we do that, the infrastructure that the council needs around that is not in place, and it's not funded to be delivered. It's not funded to be delivered. So I find myself saying, well, it's a binary thing. I either have to vote for it or against it. The owners in those areas don't mind paying urban rates, but what they really want is the means to be able to urbanise to achieve the development outcomes that they want, that we theoretically want, but in the reality, we as council family prevent. So I have to say no to this. I'm disappointed about that, but there is a specific reason in that location. I didn't want to put an amendment up for Hengaia because I suspect it would have failed for want of a seconder, but I find myself having to express my vote accordingly on this, not because the services aren't available, but because the capacity to develop doesn't exist in that location.
Would you consider noting against the Hengaia?
Well, if that's an option, Chair, because I don't disagree with the principle here. If there's a way to be able to have a carve-out for Hengaia, great. But if there isn't something for Hengaia, then I have to vote against the policy itself.
I would suggest, I think, a way forward would be to note against your vote against the inclusion of Hengaia. Any other speakers for or against before I take it to the vote?
Madam Chair, I wish to speak, albeit somewhat briefly, and my apologies for missing the earlier part of this meeting. I went to the funeral of one Pat Stevens, who had been a parishioner at St Barnabas, where I worship, for the last 90 years. She was 98, and when she came from Tonga at 8 years old, she became part of that community, and she continued to remain part of that community. And it really caused me to reflect, as I saw so many familiar faces today, just how important local government is to our communities. But it also had me reflecting on the fact that I'm not just sitting here as a councillor elected from that area of Albert Eden Puketapapa. I'm sitting here as a regional councillor. I also have visited these areas. And as you know, Madam Chair, I grew up in Hingaia. I know that area very, very well. And it's probably for that reason that I gave a number of impassioned speeches in this chamber about the need to stage the unitary plan, because anybody with a calculator could have worked out that we were not going to be able to implement the unitary plan all at once. And that has been the arm up our back all the way through. It is the very, it's the depth of the problems that we're experiencing here today. And I missed all the debate, and I'm sure you were all most eloquent, and I'm very sorry to have missed it. And this is in no way a disrespect to officers who I know are working diligently and have done a superb job for us. But my feeling is we've got a huge problem facing us right now because of a bad decision we made not to stage the unitary plan. And it's kind of muddling our way to try and hold the thing together rather than taking a step back and saying, well, at some point we're going to have to bite the bullet on this, and we're going to have to do a reset, and we're going to have to do a rethink. So exercising my right as a regional councillor, not just a councillor who might happen to represent Albert Eden Puketapapa, I have a lot of sympathy with those who are sitting around the table trying to draw our attention to the fact that the council has a deficit here. It's an enormous one. And Jim Staybeck, who is our new CEO and whom I have the greatest regard for, he's going to have to come to us with some pretty bold, I'm loath to use the word contestable policy advice because it always sounds so cliched, but he's going to have to come to us with some pretty big thinking ideas if we are to actually follow through on what the unitary plan requires of us. So I've got a lot of sympathy for the community spirit that's been expressed by Councillor Watson and Councillor Walker and Sayers here today. And for that reason, I think it is time to draw a line in the sand where things are very difficult and where we perhaps do need to have a rethink. So I will be voting against this, and that is not in any way a motion of disrespect towards our staff. It is simply that I'm here to exercise my judgment on the best information that I have received in all of the subsequent decisions and the ones that have been taken beforehand. But having been here since 2010 and watched some pretty bad decisions taken, I think we're just compounding it. So I'm voting no today.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
I'll also be voting against this, and I'd like just to echo the comments that Councillor Fletcher made. Effectively, what we've got in Auckland is a circumstance where we've zoned for far more than what we need. And we know that it's entirely inappropriate to develop all of that space quickly. We know that we can't cope in respect of infrastructure, but we know that the environment can't cope with it either. And just the other day, Councillor Coombe and I were at the Hauraki Golf Forum. I mean, the state of the golf in terms of its environmental health is disastrous. And one of the tools that we use to try and prevent growth is infrastructure, by making sure that we don't put in infrastructure to slow stuff down. It's an important tool that we don't recognise enough. And my concern is that through making this change, we're really not acknowledging that tool. It's one of the strongest tools in our toolbox, because increasingly we're being forced through government legislation and also through legal challenges by developers and the like to bring areas on that fundamentally should not be developed in respect of timing. And that is the point that Councillor Fletcher is making, and I'm on the same page. Timing is everything, and I hark back to an earlier history of Auckland. Graham Bush wrote it, decently and in order. Decently and in order. Increasingly, we are doing things that are not in order. And secondly, as it goes to, I wouldn't use that expression, but it isn't decent, it's unfair, and we're not keeping faith to people. And that is the hole that we're digging for ourselves. So retaining tools around infrastructure are vitally important. So for that reason, I'll be voting against this.
Thank you. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to...
Excuse me, Councillor.
Unless there's 3 speakers to speak in favour of the motion, I would move to
Can I just check with staff? We haven't had 3, 4 yet, so just hurry up and find 3. Okay.
Okay.
1, 2. Deputy Mayor?
You had already called me, Madam Chair, to speak. I just started
yep,
speaking.
yep.
Yeah. So,
So-
by all means, come up. Yeah, thank you. And I'm not going to be long because there's absolutely no point me revisiting the plea I made earlier. But I do think it's appropriate to perhaps look at what this really means for the communities that are now on the receiving end. Aside from the not insignificant 16 to 29% rate increases, and I say that again, 16 to 29% at a time of COVID-19 and all the hardships, and with communities that aren't wealthy communities. So think on that. As far as the decision-making process goes, it really does make me reflect on Professor Ian Shirley, who is the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Auckland University of Technology and a public policy analyst. And back in 2010, he was a pretty strident criticiser of the super city model, saying it was badly conceived, ignored history, failed to connect in any meaningful way with the diverse populations and neighbourhoods of the region, and has established a corporate framework and process that will not gain the trust of ratepayers. And when I reflect on those comments today, certainly for my area, that is going to be the consequence of this. Auckland does have a deficit across a number of areas. We know we have an infrastructure deficit. We know we have a social deficit in terms of our ability to provide housing and other social services for our population. But we also have a deficit in democracy, and that has been clearly identified over a number of years and reflected in the polling and the trust and confidence in our decision making when it comes to responding to local needs. On the relatively rare occasions people engage with the community, and this instance is a classic case in point, really. We've had an unprecedented response from Herald Island residents. Virtually 80% of them responded to this proposal. Whenuapai Village was similarly a large number, would have been up around about the 75% rate. And the net result of their detailed, their informed, their response in terms of the exact criteria set has been to be dismissed. So I would just say, Madam Chair, as we reflect on things on this final vote, that as much as numbers of people around here can do that and can accept whatever advice that's put up, there is always consequences for these sorts of decisions. And I would say that in this instance, the harm to Auckland Council's reputation, such it is going to be significant out in the northwest, and there will be no amount of casuistic explanations that will persuade the people out northwest otherwise. This proposal, as it applies to them, is unfair, It's not based on the reality on the ground. And furthermore, it's based on the full knowledge that that reality on the ground is not going to be addressed in any shape or form for the next 10 years and beyond. That's the net result. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to come back to what we're doing here, which is we're charging urban rates for all properties within the rural urban boundary. We have a rural urban boundary, and we've talked about the unitary plan and how it should be staged, how we've got it wrong, how we've got to try and get it right, we've got to fix it. We've talked about, I've listened to Councillor Watson in all of our workshops and Councillor Walker around the inequities for Herald Island. I went and visited too in Whenuapai, had a look around. And what I kept coming back to was that the same thing exists across Auckland, the same thing in different parts of Auckland in terms of services. The inequity is quite stark. And we've seen through Councillor Newman's working group how stark that is, particularly for communities in the south. So we've got Conifer Grove, who doesn't have a bus service, they have footpaths. We have parts of my Manurewa that doesn't have footpaths. And, you know, you gave a couple of examples yourself. So the inequity is across the region. What we're saying is that we're okay for the poorer suburbs to pick up the tab, continue to pick up the tab. So they've been paying urban rates for years and years and years. There's still an inequity from moving in from before the super city, but it continues. And now we're saying it's okay for them to continue to be charged urban rates, even though they don't have, they've got inequity of services. So I think I was trying to keep my regional hat on, but I was feeling compelled when I was listening to the regions that are trying to fight to keep rural rates, and I understand it, I hear what they're saying, I've got all the emails, I've got another 350 emails today as well. But let's remember the rest of Auckland, all the Aucklanders as well. I hear what Councillor Newman is saying about Hangaia wanting to develop. They're not able to develop. And that's difficult and we need to work through it. But we still have some of the poorer suburbs in Auckland without equity services, and they have been paying urban rates for a very long time. We have to get to the point where we're paying rates to get services as well. And it astounds me to hear of areas that want all of the services delivered, all the roading projects, all the community facilities, but don't want rates increase. They don't want to pay the rates to get the services that they're after. It really irks me when I look at the south, and it'll be the same in pockets of the west and other areas, people paying urban rates and not getting the same services as others. So, you know, back to we're all in it together, right? It costs money to live in a big city like this, and we have got to all be in it together from my perspective. We're all going to call inequity, doesn't matter where we live, we'll all call inequity on something. And I just want to finish with a comment that Councillor Watson made before. One half doesn't know how the other half lives. And that's a truism that I've heard here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Our final comment I think I have from Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Chair. I find it very difficult to follow that, Councillor Dalton. That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean, you make a lot of fantastic points. I just want to reflect on that briefly. A lot of my ward only has 1 footpaths on one side as well. Edsel Street in Henderson, one of the main streets in a metropolitan town centre, has one side footpaths. You know, this is not unusual, particularly not in Waitakere. The inequity is across the region, as Councillor Dalton correctly points out. I'd add to those examples, some of the poorest areas of Auckland have some of the worst environmental outcomes. Worst tree cover, worst water infrastructure, worst stormwater, worst everything in the places where people need their services the most, and they're paying the urban rates for it. I think we're making a great argument for more investment into the outer areas of Auckland as well. I want to thank Councillor Watson, Councillor Walker and others for raising these points. I've noted today that a swimming pool is desperately needed to serve the areas of Red Hills, Kumeu, Whenuapai that are covered by this proposal. That's a need. I would also be in favour of extending bus services up to these places that we're talking about. I've spoken on that topic today too. That's a need. So I just want to finish off by saying I admire your stance as well, Chair Simpson. I don't have much further to add on your stance. I just note in particular that, I appreciate that you went out there and looked for yourself as a regional councillor, as you did as well in a recent contested vote in my ward, and as many of you did. And as I was reminded then, and as I'm reminded today, we're regional councils with regional roles, and I intend to vote in support in line with that reasoning.
Thank you. Look, I'm not going to add to the debate, but I will just draw your attention to the third clause, which is a transition. So it's not doing it straight up, it's a transition, which means that the impact, the average residential impact, is an extra $73 a year as opposed to it all in one go. So it minimises the financial impact. To that end, we've got a mover and a seconder, and I will take it to the vote. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against?
No. Against.
Okay, we've got a recorder against Watson, Walker, Mulholland, Stewart, Sayers, and against Hangaya. Is that right?
Well, yes, against Hangaya. I've just discovered that we weren't able to gazette the stormwater ponds necessary for the bulk infrastructure there.
Thank you, Councillor. Right, item 13. Other rates